All right. Welcome everybody to the second quarter webinar for Revolution Rental Management. We are talking this time about evictions. So my name is Todd Orchide. I'm the CEO of Revolution. We also have a couple other people on the panel today who I'll let introduce themselves. So Zach, you first.
Hello, my name is Zach Chapman. I'm a business development manager with Revolution Rental Management. Longtime property manager. I've had my license since 2016, and I've seen a bunch of evictions.
And Abby, did you want to say a few words? I know you're just kind of hanging out in the background for most of this one, but do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi.
Hello.
So Abby is our director of operations, but yeah, Zach and I will be handling most of this today. So we will be talking about evictions, specifically evictions in a post-COVID world. So we do have a presentation that we'll go through, and then we'll have some discussion after or along the way as we go through that. But let me get up a screen share of our presentation. All righty. Okay, so welcome to everybody. As I said, this is our second quarter webinar, so we are doing these every quarter, usually towards the end of the quarter is what we're generally planning to do. So next time we'll send out a email in advance, just like you got for this one, letting you know what the topic's going to be, and we'll continue to do these every single quarter. So appreciate everybody who registers. I know most people end up watching it later as opposed to joining us live, but we appreciate everybody who gets their registrations in, and then we'll also get, of course, a recording out to everybody, like I said, after this is over. So what we're going to be covering today is a few different things about evictions. First, we'll go over just the basics of how an eviction works, what the timeline is. Since I know most clients, thankfully, haven't had to deal with an eviction, we want to cover that. We'll talk about the changes that have taken place since the pandemic, and then we'll talk about how that's kind of applying to various counties around Atlanta, specifically with lockouts more than anything. So we'll get into all that and what all that means. We'll talk about how to avoid evictions in the first place, and then, of course, how to protect yourself with some insurance products. And Zach will pitch a lot of that to you because he does that with our clients every day. And then we'll talk about collections and some big news that's come out over the last few months, which is some new squatter and eviction laws that the legislature has passed here in Georgia over the last few months. So let's start off just talking about what an eviction process looks like. So first thing, of course, is rent is due on the 1st in our leases. So, we'll talk about this in more of a general fashion for those of you who, aren't clients of ours, aren't on our standard lease. But, some of these things are going to be dictated by what's in your lease agreement. So if you've written your own lease, some of these dates might be a little bit off, but in general, this will be true for most of you in Georgia. So rent due on the 1st, usually most people are charging late fees by around the 3rd or so. And then you have to send out what's called a notice to pay or quit if someone still hasn't paid at that point. This is basically the notice to the tenant that, hey, you got to pay what you owe in the next however many days that you put on the notice, or we're going to have to file eviction against you. So that's the first step legally in the eviction process. The tenant still doesn't pay by the deadline, and we'll talk a little bit later about what that deadline is. Then that's when you can actually file the case with the magistrate court. And that's where those cases get filed. It's basically the lowest level of court where small claims and everything is heard, is the magistrate court level. Then the sheriff will go out. They'll serve the tenant with the eviction lawsuit because it is a lawsuit, so it has to get served. So the sheriff will do that, or you can pay a private process server to do it if you want, but sheriff will do it by default. The tenant then has a week to file a response with the court. So that response can be as little as one sentence that says, I don't owe the money, or it can be, this long multi-page, filing that they make through an attorney, and anything in between. But as long as they file some sort of response, then the judge will set a hearing for you to go into court and argue your case, basically. If the tenant doesn't file any response at all after 7 days, then the judge will just issue a default judgment, which basically just means you win by default. Now, what winning means in that case is you get the property back. You get possession of the property. If the tenant doesn't respond, you can't get a money judgment against the tenant, but you can get possession. And we'll talk about all the details of how that all works. But in most cases, the tenant's going to file a response. You'll show up at court, and then the judge will hear your case and issue a judgment almost all the time. As long as you've got your ducks in a row, the judge is going to rule in your favor. And then by law in the state of Georgia, the tenant has 7 days after that judgment to voluntarily leave the property. So even though the judge issues their ruling, there's still 7 days that the tenant has to get out. If they still don't leave after that 7 days, then you can file what's called a writ of possession, which basically just means, hey, you didn't get out like you were supposed to. This is what we're giving to the sheriff to forcibly remove you from the house. So then the sheriff will actually schedule with you to go out, remove the tenant. You take all the tenant's belongings out of the property, set them on the curb, and change the locks. And that's the eviction process. So, lots of steps in that process, I know, but that's how it works in this state. Zach, can you think of anything that I missed on any of that, or do you think that pretty much covers the process?
No, that was probably the best explanation I've ever heard. Just line item by line item. I mean, that's it.
Excellent. So of course, there are always things that can come up in between here that complicate things, and we're going to try to hit on a few of those, but that is the normal process, the way things should work. But let's talk about, obviously, what the big changes are after the pandemic. So things aren't quite the same before, especially for those of us in Georgia. If you've been a landlord for a long time in Georgia, you know that this has pretty much always been a very landlord-friendly state, and pretty much always, but especially when it comes to evictions. It used to be you could file an eviction and you could have it taken care of in 3 weeks, everything from beginning to end. That was the old way before the pandemic. After the pandemic, some things changed. And some of those things have remained changed. So they have not gone back to normal, basically. So one of the big things was Congress passed something called the CARES Act, which a lot of you might be familiar with from the stimulus and everything that came from that. But when it comes to evictions, what it did was it put a time delay in on the eviction process. So basically they said, if you serve a tenant a notice to pay rent or quit, so remember that's the initial notice that starts the eviction process, you have to wait 30 days after that before you can actually file an eviction. Now, there's some exceptions to this depending on whether you have a government-backed mortgage or not. So it gets technical, but in almost all cases, I would say 95% plus of our clients, the 30 days is a necessary delay, unfortunately, because of that law. Everything else in the CARES Act, they basically let expire. So all the other restrictions that they put in there, they all expired after a certain period of time. A lot of it was linked to whenever the government lifted their declaration of emergency, but they forgot, supposedly, to include an expiration on this part of the CARES Act. So basically, forever now, there's a 30-day waiting period before you can file an eviction, unless we can get the law changed. So in Georgia, this used to only be 3 days. So the way we've always done it at Revolution is we would serve them with the notice on the 4th, and we would file the eviction on the 8th. So we were able to get these things done really quick. But nowadays, after COVID, that's not the case anymore. Now we're waiting until the next month before we can actually file the eviction. So it's a big change for the eviction process. The other problem we've run into is even after that 30 days, you still have a problem with several of the counties around Metro Atlanta where everything is moving very, very slowly. So you get the eviction filed, but then it takes 3 weeks sometimes for the sheriff to serve the tenant with the lawsuit. Then if the tenant files a response, sometimes you're sitting around waiting for 2 months to get a court date. So, all of this really originated with the pandemic. It used to be it didn't matter what county you were in Georgia, you were going to get a very quick hearing date. The sheriff was going to execute a writ really quick. All of it was very speedy. That's not the case nowadays in some Georgia counties, unfortunately. So let's talk about some of those specific counties, just so you're aware of where these issues are. So, at Revolution, we pretty much cover the entire Metro Atlanta area. So we're covering everything from where do you think our furthest property is, Zach? Is it LaGrange, or do you think we have anything further?
God, do we have one in LaGrange?
We do have a couple down there.
Probably
yeah.
LaGrange. I know we have some in Woodstock. Further north than that, also we have one almost in Gainesville. I forget where it's at.
That's right. Yeah, I forgot
That
about that. That
townhome.
out there.
Dalton,
Yeah,
maybe?
yeah, getting out there.
I think it's Dalton.
Yeah, so I mean, we've got a service area that covers basically everything from LaGrange almost clear up to University of Georgia almost. So I mean, it's a huge service area. So the vast majority of these counties are still very friendly. We if we file an eviction, our headquarters is in Coweta County, so it's down on the south side of Atlanta. If I file an eviction here, I can have the entire thing taken care of in 3 or 4 weeks. But that's not the case everywhere. So unfortunately, there's 4 problem counties we're dealing with. So the biggest problem is Fulton County. So for those of you who are investors from out of state who aren't as familiar with Atlanta, Fulton County is basically the central county of the city. So that's where downtown is. That's where Buckhead is. The airport is in Fulton County. All of that is in that. All of that's Fulton County basically. There are the absolute worst of the worst when it comes to evictions getting processed. Next behind that is probably Clayton County, which is 1 county south, basically. Those of you who own properties in places like Riverdale, or in I think parts of College Park might be. Those are Clayton County. So when we're there, it's not as bad as Fulton, but there are significant delays in that county. DeKalb somewhat to a lesser extent, and then Cobb County is probably, it's worse than all the other suburban counties, but it's nowhere close to as bad as Fulton or Clayton. But all 4 of these counties we're seeing delays in. And some of you may have seen me on the news. I appeared on the news probably, I don't know, about maybe a year ago talking about this with a reporter. So this has been an ongoing long-term problem after COVID. We've been trying to spread the word about it to everyone. But in these counties, you can always expect significant delays. So we're actually recommending to our clients, if you have property there, nothing you can do about that. You deal with it as it comes along. If you have to do it as an eviction. But we don't recommend acquiring additional properties in these counties. We make sure that you work your way around to the surrounding suburbs of Atlanta as the better places to buy property. And Zach, that's where I would kick things over to you. I mean, in these surrounding counties, where would you say right now are the best markets for investors if they're out there looking to buy some investment rental property?
At least an hour outside of Atlanta. It really doesn't matter what direction you go in. Go up to Gwinnett County, go up to Suwannee, Duluth, Beaufort. That's moving along just fine. And then, further, about an hour south of the airport, it starts to get better. I'd say just the closer you get to the city of Atlanta and downtown Atlanta and those few counties surrounding it, the worse it gets. The more backed up they are. They're still backed up from the eviction moratorium.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to get in front of, not necessarily to get in front of a judge, but to schedule that set out with the sheriff. I remember last year, I was participating in an eviction in DeKalb County, and we actually got through magistrate court relatively quickly. I think it was 3 or 4 weeks to get the set out scheduled, and I walked the writ over myself from the magistrate department over to the sheriff's department, and they told me 8 months, or it was 8 months. So you can't really do. You're at the mercy of the sheriff at that point. You can't do much. You don't want to call them and bug them every day. They could, take your file and put it on the bottom of the stack. But yeah, I suppose they've gotten a little bit better in the past year, but I know they're still really backed up.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point because I kind of, skimmed right by that. The fact that we had an eviction moratorium in place for
Mhm.
a long time. I didn't even mention that during the pandemic, but I mean, that was the case. I mean, we actually weren't allowed to file evictions for a period of time. And it wasn't as bad here in Georgia. I mean, some states had like a 2 year moratorium where they weren't doing any evictions. We didn't have that big of a problem, but we did have, in a lot of counties where we couldn't file evictions at all. And like Zach said, they basically just kept piling up. So, I mean, there were still the same number of people who weren't paying their rent as there always was, if not more. But those cases just kept stacking on top of other cases, and they're still not caught up from all that. So, that's all contributing to this problem. So, Getting away from the pandemic part of things, just talking about evictions in general, some general advice if you're a landlord navigating this stuff yourself. It's never a good idea to try to handle an eviction in court all by yourself. If you don't have a property manager, of course, we recommend you have a property manager. We recommend you work with Revolution. But if you don't, and you're trying to manage as the landlord solo, then we don't recommend that you go into court without an attorney. Even we don't go into court without an attorney. I used to do evictions myself. Probably 10 years ago, I would actually go into court and try those cases myself. I know Zach has done some at certain points, but I don't even, I can't do as well, even though I've done, probably 100 plus evictions at this point. I can't do what an attorney can do because that's all they do day in and day out with these cases is process eviction matters. So it's always better to have an attorney if you have to actually go to court on these things. We've seen landlords show up thinking they have just the most clear-cut case ever. Tenant just didn't pay the rent, but then the tenant shows up with a buddy of theirs that's a high-dollar attorney, and they just eviscerate the landlord because they just start throwing around legal motions that the landlord has no idea what they are. And the judge has an obligation to hear these motions, give them whatever credibility they deserve under the law. The judge can't do anything about it, even if he knows, okay, this tenant didn't pay the rent. It's pretty simple, but I have no choice. This attorney made this motion that I've got to actually consider. So you want to have an attorney there that knows how to respond to all these things. And just by showing up with the attorney yourself, that's going to send a message to the tenant. If they're showing up without an attorney, then it's going to tell them, okay, I'm outgunned. I probably just want to settle this before it gets in front of the judge. Or if the tenant has an attorney, then their attorney is going to look at it and say, all right, let's get together with their attorney and we'll work something out here instead of having to go to trial. So it almost always works out better just by having the attorney there, even if it's a pretty straightforward case. And then the attorney can also write a consent judgment for you so you can get this all done just with a signature and not having to do a trial. That just makes things so much easier. Anything you can think of I'm missing on that stuff, Zach?
A little bit. Just backing up just a little bit to the CARES Act. A lot of private landlords and homeowners don't know about the CARES Act. I didn't know about the CARES Act until about a year ago. And I remember asking you about it. I said, hey, I've seen people, get through it without dealing with the CARES Act. They didn't even know about it. But I remember your response was very clear, and it was, they can, but if that tenant shows up with an attorney, or if they know what they're doing and they know the rules and the laws, they can say, hey, CARES Act. They didn't wait 30 days before filing. So guess what? Now you're back at the drawing board. And, it's you got to refile, you got to get the ball rolling again, and it's a pain. So
yeah, I mean that's a fantastic point. Is if you make a mistake on these things, you're basically back to square one. And when we're talking about, like Zach said, 8 months to get to an eviction, if you're starting at square one again on an 8-month process, you're now at 16 months. Just because you made a mistake on how you sent out a notice. So I mean that's why it's so important to make sure that we get all this stuff right so we don't have these sorts of problems. Okay, so let's talk about some other wrinkles that can come into the eviction process. This is one that always catches people by surprise. A lot of people aren't aware of this. A tenant at any time can file for bankruptcy, and basically what that does is it stops everything dead in its tracks. So it's not just evictions, it's basically any civil filing whatsoever. So any lawsuits that would be related to that tenant automatically get paused. It's part of bankruptcy law. It's called an automatic stay. So if you file eviction against the tenant and then they file bankruptcy, everything comes to a grinding halt. The only way you can get things to move forward is you have to appear in federal bankruptcy court and make what's called a motion to lift the automatic stay. So this is why I say it's so important to have an attorney. You literally can't show up in bankruptcy court by yourself without an attorney. They won't allow you to do it. You have to be represented by an attorney in that case. So you need to have a bankruptcy attorney who is allowed to appear in federal court, because not every attorney can do that. And then they have to make this motion for you in order to get this case to be heard by the local judge at the magistrate level. So again, just another reason why it's so important to have a good landlord-tenant attorney handling these things, because if this comes up, you don't have to worry about it. If you got an attorney, they'll just know what to do immediately. they'll file that motion and they'll get things moving again. And it still will delay things a few weeks because everything has to go to the bankruptcy judge. You have to make your motion. He has to issue his motion to the magistrate court. So it takes a couple of weeks, but a couple of weeks is better than just sitting there for months on end because you're not able to do anything without an attorney. So, keep that in mind. There are these kind of games, and we have a term for it in the industry. We call people professional tenants. That's the kind of person who knows how to use all these rules to their advantage, and they just go around ripping off one landlord after another. And this is one of the things that they know how to do to basically delay an eviction case, just by filing a bankruptcy. And the thing is, they can then withdraw the bankruptcy filing later, and they don't even have to go through the bankruptcy process. They're just using it as a stalling tactic. So, there's all kinds of games that can be played here. So it's so important to have good representation for this kind of stuff. So let's talk about those court costs and attorney's fees, since we're talking so much about using a good attorney. What this is going to cost you if you actually have to go to eviction is generally somewhere between $150 to $300 to actually, file your case. That includes your writ fee and all the different things you'll pay. So that's the average in most metro Atlanta counties. Attorney's fees, if you hire an attorney, are usually going to be somewhere between $600, right around there. $600 to $900 is usually what you're going to end up paying. It can get up to that couple $1,000 level, though, if you have to deal with a bankruptcy or an appeal or something like that. So in most cases, you'll end up spending less than $1,000 to get an eviction handled. But there are those weird cases that'll take a little bit more. Our leases, and we recommend if you're an individual landlord that you put this into your lease also, that you can charge all of this to the tenant security deposit, basically, so that they're required to pay it. So if you have it in the lease that says any eviction costs, whether it's court costs or attorney's fees, are billed to the tenant, then number one, you can take it from their deposit, but number two, you can get a judgment against them when you go to that bankrupt or when you go to that eviction court. You can get a judgment for that amount against the tenant. So not just for the rent, but for all of your costs to process the eviction also. So that way, when you go to collections later to collect that from the tenant, you're able to get that money back and not just the rent amount. So keep that in mind. Okay, so the sheriff. This is what Zach was talking about earlier when he had to take that writ from the judge over to the sheriff and get that scheduled. This is where everything ultimately gets held up right now. So there's a little bit of delay in getting cases heard, but the vast majority of delays that we're seeing in those counties we talked about is once the eviction gets sent over to the sheriff to actually kick out the tenant. So you've gotten the judgment from the judge. They've given them the 7 days. The tenant hasn't left. You file with the sheriff or you file with the writ to get the sheriff to remove the tenant. But then the sheriff just sits there and doesn't do anything for the longest time, like 8 months, like Zach said. The longest we had, I believe, was something like 21 months. After when that was one that started early in COVID, we had to wait almost 2 years to get that tenant out. And almost all of that was waiting on the sheriff. So it basically gets sent over, it gets put in this giant pile, and they've got limited resources. And the sad truth is some of these sheriffs are just in no hurry to do it because they are elected officials. And in a lot of cases, what they're looking at is I've got a small number of landlords who are going to be mad at me, or I've got a much bigger pool of tenants who are going to be mad at me if I evict them. So who do I want to give preference? And some of these sheriffs just say, you know what, we're just going to delay things and make things better for the tenants. And, that's how they're doing business, unfortunately. So we do see these things stretching out for many, many months in some cases. Zach, what's the longest one that you've seen at this point? Was it the 8 month one, or have you seen them go longer?
God, I believe it was the 8 months one. 21 months. That's absolutely insane. That is that's near 2 years. That is almost 2 full years of no income from your rental property, waiting on the sheriff. That's awful. I would say mine was 8 months, but 21 months is I think the longest I've heard so far.
Yeah, and sadly, I don't think we had the record on that. I want to say that there was another property manager I talked to who was over the 2 year mark at one point. So I mean, these things just get crazy in some cases. So that's the biggest problem we're seeing. Now, some good news is that they did come out this year among the changes that the state legislature made is they tried to find a solution to this, and they passed this new law that says if you can't get a lockout done by a sheriff quickly, I believe it's 14 days. I have it on the slide here. If they won't schedule it within 14 days, then you can go to anybody who's on the peace officers list, which is basically, I mean, there's tons of people across the state. You've got it's not just police officers; it's also corrections employees. It's I forget. It's what is this? Forestry service. That's it. That's the term I was trying to think of. Forestry service. All these people are on the peace officers list. So, any of them technically under the new law could be used to conduct an eviction. The problem we're running into is the way the law was written. It says that you have to take someone that's on the approved peace officers list by the local sheriff. So the law says every sheriff is supposed to put together a list of all these people. It's basically all the peace officers in their jurisdiction, so in their county. But the problem is every sheriff that our attorneys have gone to has basically said, we don't have that list. We haven't put that together yet. And then when our attorney asks, well, when's it going to be put together? They say, we really don't know. We're not really in any hurry to put it together. So, it's kind of in this situation now where the state legislature has told the sheriffs, this is what you're supposed to do. And then they're playing a game of chicken where they're just saying, all right, well, we're not going to do it. What are you going to do about it? So, we're still in the same situation. Our trade association, that's NARPM, we have an attorney who's working with the counties and the sheriffs trying to get this resolved. But so far, no problem. So our lawmakers have tried to fix the problem and haven't been too successful, unfortunately, so far. So if we get past that and we actually get to the eviction itself, we call it a lockout usually. The way it works is the sheriff will set that date. So they'll give us an advance notice, usually of a few days, and then they'll tell us how many people you have to have there for your crew. So the sheriff doesn't actually remove all the tenant stuff. So they don't show up with a truck and get rid of all the stuff in the house. All the sheriff does is knock on the door and with their gun on their side say, get out of the house, and then that's kind of the authority telling you got to get out. And I've seen sheriffs that actually have to go room by room through the house and drag people out because they refuse to leave. That happens. So that's what they're there for. But that's where their responsibility ends. They get the people out of the house and then they tell you, get all the people's stuff out of the house. So you have to have people that show up to do that. So usually what the sheriffs will do is they'll have a standard requirement for that. So a common one is you have to have 2 people on your eviction crew per bedroom. So if you've got a 3-bedroom house, it's going to require a crew of 6 people to show up. So you have to have that ready. And if you show up at the eviction time and it's just you and a buddy there and the sheriff sees that, he's going to say, nope, sorry, I'm out of here. And he's going to leave. And you're going to be stuck there waiting for another eviction to be scheduled. So you'll have to call up the sheriff again and say, all right, let's get on the calendar. And now you wait another 8 months to get put back on the calendar because you didn't have enough people there. So a lot of these sheriffs are completely no nonsense about this. They will not make any exceptions. And as soon as they see that you don't have the people there they told you to have there, they're hopping back in their car and they're leaving. So very important to make sure this is taken care of. Zach, what have you seen on these evictions? What's some of the crazy eviction crew requirements you've seen?
I saw 9 for a 4-bedroom house, and it was less than a week's notice. So we didn't mention this before, but every now and then the sheriff's department will have a cancellation. Someone moves, someone pays their rent, catches up, and they got a slot open. They will call you with very little notice, and you can get your eviction taken care of. You can get your setup done. But I'm talking very little notice. It's 24 hours, sometimes less. I think the one that I'm speaking about was on a Thursday or Friday. So we had the weekend to get 9 guys together. I hardly know 9 guys. So it's, I mean, maybe if I had to dig deep, but yeah, I mean, and it doesn't have to be 9 able-bodied people. I mean, it just has to be a warm body. You can get anybody. As long as the sheriff sees somebody, they don't even have to move stuff. But you can use someone to fill in the blanks, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing on that, though, is if they're not able-bodied, usually they'll give you a time limit too. So they'll say you've got 2 hours to get all your stuff out of the house, and then if you've got 8 non-able-bodied people and 1 able-bodied, you're probably not going to get it done.
I've seen. I believe what we did was we got 2 different landscaping crews and then a couple of vendors to show up. It was like 36 hours notice in Atlanta. It was a 4-bedroom house. They wanted 9 guys. So
Yeah, this stuff can be crazy. So I mean, that's why it's important, and this is why not just joking around about marketing our services, but I mean, this is why it's so helpful to have a property management company. Is they've got all this stuff already lined up. I mean, we've got eviction crews ready to go. If we get a call saying tomorrow we need to have 8 people out of the house, we can do that without a problem. Whereas the average person would be a big struggle for them to be able to do that. So just one more reason to have the professional help with your property management. So let's talk about some things that can get you in trouble when it comes to evictions. So the law treats this all very seriously. So I know from your perspective as a landlord, you just think, hey, the tenant didn't pay me my rent, they need to go. It's that simple. That's all it is. And I get that. Of course, I'm a landlord myself, so I certainly understand that sentiment. I've had to have evictions done on my properties. But the law doesn't look at it the same way. They don't really sympathize all that much. The way they look at it is there's a process you have to go through, and you got to go through the process no matter what. So if you try to short circuit that process, very bad things can happen. So on the lower end of the bad things that can happen is what they call constructive eviction, which basically means that you have not actually evicted the tenant, but you've taken some kind of action that makes it like effectively you have evicted the tenant. So you've made the property uninhabitable. So a classic example of this, back in the old days, landlords would go out and take the doors off of a house to make it to where nobody wanted to live there. Well, nowadays that's called constructive eviction. You're not allowed to do that. So you can't cut off utilities. You can't, take the breaker out of the air conditioning system. You can't do any of these kind of things. If you do, then a judge can call that constructive eviction and basically void your lease. So you can get no money from the tenant. You can't go after them for your eviction costs, your attorney fees, any of that kind of stuff. They basically just get off scot-free. So, you want to avoid doing anything that can make it look like you were trying to push the tenant out without going through the process. The other thing to keep in mind is this sounds crazy, and we have this conversation with our clients all the time, but when you are a tenant of a property, you have what's called legal possession of the property. It's part of what they call the bundle of rights, is possession. And what that means is you alone, as the person named as the tenant on that lease, have the right to be in that house. So even though you as the landlord own the house, you don't have possession of it anymore. So while the tenant's there, until they've been kicked out, you don't have the right to go in the house. You don't have the right to, just show up there whenever you want and harass them or anything like that. So you can get in trouble actually criminally if you go out to the house and try to do those kinds of things, like go out and take off a door or remove the air conditioner or anything. Not only can that be considered constructive eviction, but the tenant can call the police and say that you're trespassing. And of course, your response will probably be, well, it's my house. How can I be trespassing? But it's trespassing because you don't have possession of the house. You just have ownership of it. So those are 2 different things under the law. So we actually had a client who did this. It was a crazy situation. We had a tenant who was in an eviction status, and while we were evicting them, they submitted a service request and said the hot water heater had ruptured and it was leaking all over the property. So of course we wanted to get, even though this tenant wasn't paying rent and hadn't been for several months, we still wanted to get the repairs done because this could damage the property. You've got water leaking all over everywhere from a water heater. So the tenant barred us entry to the property and said, no, you can't come in, even though they submitted a service request, because they were worried that we were going to go in there and try to kick them out because we were in an eviction process. So we told the landlord, nothing we can do. We've talked to the lawyers. They say if they're telling you you're not allowed to go in, then you're not allowed to go in. So the landlord didn't take our advice on that. They showed up at the house with their key, went into the house and fixed the water heater. Well, once they left, what they found out was a sheriff showed up at their house and said, "We have a warrant for your arrest for trespassing on your own property." And they were arrested, got the mug shot, got the whole thing done. So it was a nightmare. I mean, they were guilty, technically, of trespassing on their own house. It sounds like a crazy situation, but those sorts of things can happen. Zach, have you seen these kind of weird situations with constructive eviction or anything?
I've not seen anyone actually get arrested, pardon me, but I have seen some close calls. I've seen landlords go out and change the locks. They show up and the place is trashed, and they say, "How could someone be living here? They got to be gone." And obviously they're not, so they change locks anyways. And then the tenant shows up later, and locks have been changed, and they are calling us and throwing a fit because they can't get inside the home they're renting. Um, I've I've not seen anyone go to jail yet, but that's absolutely wild. Uh, Basically, the tenants have more right to be there than the homeowner. Even if they owe you thousands of dollars and they're not paying rent, you got to go through the correct processes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up about the lock changes and thinking that someone's gone. Because I mean, this is a situation that comes up a lot. Is a question of, is the tenant still there? Because sometimes it's not as clear as you think it is. You show up at the house, because we do. I think during an eviction process, I think it's every 2 weeks that our leasing agent goes out to the house and checks to see if the tenant is still there while we're going through the eviction. And sometimes he has to call me up and say, I'm not sure whether they're gone or not. There's not a lot of furniture there, but there's a mattress on the bedroom floor, and there's still a TV in the living room, and there's a frozen pizza in the fridge. Are they gone or are they not? And some of these times I have to call our attorneys because it's not clear enough. And I'll tell you, more often than not, if it's even slightly unclear, the attorney's going to say, "Nope, you got to wait. You can't consider it abandoned." And sometimes it's as much as just a mattress in a bedroom is enough for the attorney to say, "No, it's too unclear," because you can't require that tenants have furniture. All you can say is, is there evidence that they're living there or not? And some people could just live on a mattress. So, a lot of these things get very complicated. And then if you try to change the locks, they've got you dead to rights at that point. There's nothing you can do. They're going to get a judgment against you, and you're not going to be able to get any rent out of them. So very important that you go through the right process here. So, of course, the best way to deal with this is just to avoid the eviction in the first place. So how do you do that? Thorough tenant screening is always the best way to avoid evictions. And you want to have reasonable requirements on that. You don't want to be crazy. I see landlords on places like Bigger Pockets, and they'll sometimes talk about, "Oh, I denied people on their application because their car was dirty," or something like that. I mean, these are crazy things. We don't want to have those kind of criteria, but we do want to have very clear financial criteria, because that's ultimately what matters. We want to make sure that we're screening people to make sure that they actually have the ability to afford the property they're trying to rent. So part of that is making sure you don't overprice your property, because only bad tenants are desperate enough to rent a house that you've set the rent way too high on. And this kind of feeds back to our last webinar from a few months ago that some of you might remember, where we talked about pricing your property right and why that's so important to get it rented. This factors into the quality of tenant you get too. If a property is in a neighborhood that generally rents for $2,500 and you're trying to rent your house for $3,000, then no sane tenant who has a good credit history is going to want to rent that house, because they're smart. They've got good credit. They have a good job. They know what the neighborhood rents for. So they're not going to pay you $500 more than everybody else is paying. So who's going to come to you and rent that house? Well, it's going to be the guy who's desperate. It's going to be the person who has no other option. No one else will rent to them. So they're just looking for any opportunity they can get, even if they have to overpay, even if they know they can't afford it. They're just looking for a place to go. So, a great way to keep yourself out of trouble is to make sure you have fair market rent on your property, because then you have a wide range of tenants applying for it, and you can pick a good one who has a good financial background. So always make sure that you're keeping your prices reasonable. The other thing I would say is never rent to someone who still owes a prior landlord money. it's okay to give someone a second chance if they've had an eviction in their background, or they filed bankruptcy in the past, or maybe they had a foreclosure. We saw a lot of that after the 2008 global financial crisis. A lot of people were renters again who had been homeowners before, and they've been foreclosed on because their adjustable rate and mortgage got crazy. That stuff happens. There's nothing wrong if someone makes a lot of money and they generally have a good credit score. Nothing wrong with giving somebody a second chance, but they need to have made good on all their prior obligations. So if they owed a prior landlord $2,000 and they still haven't paid him, then that's a good sign to you that they're not going to pay you either. So, second chances are good, but only if you've made amends. The other thing I would say is it's very, very easy for people to fake things nowadays when it comes to income verification. So, I see Zach shaking his head, aggressively there. He must have seen this. There are actually websites. If you go on Google right now, you can search and find places that will create fake pay stubs for you. There are places that will even act as your landlord, so that you can put a fake phone number on an application. The landlord can call this phone number and someone will pretend to be your prior landlord to give you a good rental reference. All of this stuff is available nowadays. So it's very easy for someone to trick you. So that's why we as a property management company, we use positive income verification by linking to the applicant's bank account. And it actually checks what are the deposits that have come into their bank account over the past year. And we can see that entire history and we know what their real income is. So that's something that you can't do as an individual landlord. So it's just another thing to add to the list of why it's so important to use professional property management. But I mean, that can get you out of a lot of trouble in those kind of cases. Zach, I saw you shaking your head there. What have you seen with these fakes and that kind of identity thieves, all that kind of stuff?
I used to process applications. I have seen everything. I've seen fake driver's license. I've seen fake check stubs. I've seen fake rental verifications from landlords. I've seen fake employment verifications. I have seen fake tax returns. Fraud is real. Don't do it yourself. It's too much of a risk. It's your property on the line. It's not just your property on the line. It's your property. If you put someone in there, you get a bad placement. Depending on where you're at, like discussed, previously, it could be 6 to 8 months before you get them out. So it's not just your property. It's a whole year's worth of income from your investment that you're putting on the line. Go the extra mile. Hire a professional property management company like us, like Revolution Rental Management. Let us screen your applicants. There's no better way to do it. It's not to mention all the fair housing laws and things that a private landlord may not know. And just kind of circling back to what Todd said about no sane tenant will apply to a property that's $500 over market rent. Just would like to throw a little note in there. Don't skimp on the repairs, and if the carpet's trashed and you're going to list your property with carpet that is absolutely shot, only bad tenants are going to rent a place with trash carpet. So little side note, but I thought I would throw that in there.
No, that's a great point. I mean, I completely failed to mention that, but I mean, the condition of the property matters just as much as the right rent. I mean, if a neighborhood rents for $2,500 generally, and you've got yours listed for $2,500, but you got marks all over the walls and the carpet smells like animals, and it's just a nasty place to be, you're in the same situation because you're basically overpriced, even though it's market rent, just because the property's in such bad shape. So fantastic point. Okay, very good. So let's talk about payment plans. This is another way to avoid an eviction. So this is a case where you screen the tenant as best you could, but still they get into a situation where they're behind on the rent. You can avoid an eviction by doing a payment plan. So most cases where you run into this situations are unavoidable. So, that's why we say, do the thorough screening. But even in those cases, we see, obviously, we manage thousands of properties over the years. We see cases where people who have 800 credit scores, they make 6 times the rent. It's a perfect tenant. But then 9 months into the lease, there's a divorce and all of a sudden financial situation has completely changed, or they lost their job. It was just a layoff. A lot of this stuff happened in 2008. um, Even the best tenant can find themselves in a situation where they can't pay the rent. So it helps to have ways out that don't involve eviction if you can. So a great way to do that is a payment plan. We call ours an eviction avoidance program, an EAP. Basically, what we do is we allow the tenant, if they get behind a month, they can set up a payment plan up to 24 months, but they have to sign a new lease that has a slightly increased rent and a service fee to do that. But it's basically giving them an opportunity to take this $2,000, say they owe, and instead of getting kicked out of the house and adding on attorney's fees and all this kind of stuff, they can say, you know what? I didn't pay this month, but I'll start paying my rent on time again next month. I've got myself back on my feet, and I'll just pay this extra $100 a month to get paid off that balance that I worked up that month I skipped. Most tenants are going to try to do that if they have the opportunity to, and far too many landlords don't even give this a try. They just jump straight to the eviction. So this is a great way to avoid all the problems with that eviction. And instead of waiting 8 months to get rid of someone, you can just get them back to paying on time the next month. So definitely something to keep in mind. Now, oh, yes, you have something to add, Zach?
Yes. That is also helpful because you cannot accept, normally you can't accept money from a tenant in the same month that you're going to file for eviction. So I'm not too familiar with the EAP, the eviction avoidance program, but I'm guessing you have some kind of language in there that if they default on that agreement, that we're able to kind of get the ball rolling on filing.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And that's another good point that a lot of people aren't aware of. If you send someone a notice to vacate, so basically their 3-day notice or 30-day under CARES Act, then if you take money from them after that, let's say they owe you $2,000 and then they come to you with $200 and you take that money, you're pretty much dead in the water until next month. You're not going to be able to file an eviction then, because now, as far as the law is concerned, you've accepted payment. It wasn't payment in full, but it looks like you made a deal, basically. So, you got to be careful about those sorts of things. So when you do a payment plan, like Zach says, with our EAP, we have it set, it's a written agreement. So we have the lease agreement that they're signing a lease extension on, but there's also a separate EAP agreement that specifically lays out the terms of the EAP that says, hey, you have to keep up with your payments on these dates. And if you don't, we can go straight to eviction. We don't have to give you a second opportunity on a payment plan. We can just go straight to file. So, it's important to make sure you have those things worked out if you're going to do a payment plan. Okay, so protection from non-paying tenants. So we've done everything we possibly can. We've screened right. We've got payment plans. We've done everything we possibly can to protect ourselves. Still, like I said, there's always those cases of divorce, job loss, all that kind of stuff. Nationwide, the average runs about 5% for the tenants who have to be evicted. So of all the tenants out there, about 5% are going to need to be evicted. If you use professional property management, that number drops about by half to 2.5%. At Revolution, we've maintained a less than 1% eviction rate for several years now, I think since before the pandemic, if I remember right. So we're doing even better than the property management average. But just by having a property manager, you basically cut in half your risk of having to deal with an eviction just because of this better screening, better management. It keeps you out of trouble a lot more. But even then, we still have evictions. As good as we try to be when it comes to tenant screening and everything, we still have a few evictions we have to process every year. There's no way to avoid it 100%. So you want to be able to protect yourself. So there are ways to mitigate that risk. Somebody has to be that landlord that deals with that 1% of tenants who get evicted, or 5% at the worst end. So, basically the only way to do that is insurance. And I'm going to let Zach talk about our owner benefit package. This is something you can only get through property managers. So Zach, talk about that protection that landlords can get from evictions.
Absolutely. I've actually become a huge fan of Steady lately. One of the most appealing things that they offer, in my opinion, is the option for lump sum payment at the beginning of a lease. I think it's 7% or 8%, and they have some other plans that they do, but they'll offer to pay you 92% of all the rent she would have collected for the year. Uh, they'll reach out to you directly after we have a signed lease and a tenant scheduled to move in. If anything happens with the tenant, you don't have to give it back. I've seen some investors take advantage of it who want to, use that money to put a down payment on another property or do a bunch of repairs on a different investment property. But I've seen some of our clients take advantage of it. They just paid that 8%, but they're not worried anymore about what's going on with their tenant. Are they paying on the first? Are they paying on the second? Are they going to be late this month? Did something happen? They're not worried about it. They're sleeping better at night because they've already gotten all their rent money for the year. So that's one. I'm a huge fan of that. A lot of the prospective clients, owners that I talk to on a daily basis, they seem to be a fan of it. I've signed people up just, who are interested in that. But if you don't go with that, still there are some guarantees, and Steady helps us facilitate some of these guarantees. Like our lost rent guarantee. I believe it caps at $5,000, but that's a lost rent guarantee. I'm not familiar with any other property management company that guarantees lost rent. Maybe some out west, but I don't know of any other property management company in Georgia that has a lost rent guarantee. So that combined with our own guarantees, our property damage guarantee, it's $3,000 on our gold plan, our premium plan. I don't know of any other property management company who offers a property damage guarantee. And I've seen quite a few evictions. It's an understatement. I've seen a lot of evictions. I've never seen an eviction where the tenant leaves and the owner regains possession of the house and it's perfect. It's always, I would say, 100% of the time, it's trashed. It's messed up. They haven't paid rent. They haven't kept up with the property. So we got you covered on all fronts. Lost rent, property damage. Those are two really big concerns. And I would just say, even if you don't go with us, go with a property management company. Don't screen your tenants yourself. Let a professional do it. There's way too much fraud out there.
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to these insurance policies, like Zach's talked about, whether it's the financial services product where you can get your rent paid up front, or you get your protection with your rent guarantee and your property damage guarantee, the only way, at least in this country, that you can get those things is through a property manager. And not even a lot of property managers, like Zach said. As far as I know, we're the only ones offering a lot of these things in Atlanta. There's others, across the country, but it's the only place it's even a possibility. There's no insurance company in the United States that I'm aware of that offers rent insurance to individual landlords. In other countries, this is the thing. So if you go to Australia, for example, you can literally at the checkout line at the grocery store, there's like a little card there you can buy, like a gift card that's buy landlord insurance for your rental property, because it's owning rental property is like a big investment vehicle in Australia. So this is like a big product. That's not a thing in the United States. So here, the only way to get these kind of protections is to go through a property management company, but it does protect you. So, I mean, for us, like Zach talked about, Steady, our insurance partner, they provide 2 months of rent coverage. And then if you're on our gold plan, we provide another 2 months of rent coverage. So, I mean, you've got up to 4 months of available rent coverage. Plus, you've got the property damage Zach talked about, plus pet damage guarantees. All this kind of stuff is something you can get only through a property manager. So think about that when you're trying to decide what to do.
I couldn't mention all that without also mentioning our 21-day leasing guarantee. I know it's kind of unrelated, but they go hand in hand. If you're on our gold plan with all the protections and the guarantees that we offer, we also offer a 21-day leasing guarantee, where as long as your property is ready to go, we agree on the rental rate. There's nothing to stop it from being rented, no cosmetic issues, no major repairs needed. If you are on the market longer than 21 days, we don't earn a leasing fee. We don't charge it to you. That's also another one I don't know of any other property management company offering. I have seen some offering 29-day or 30-day guarantees where they'll give you a reduction on the monthly management or the leasing fee, or they'll give you a month of free management. I've not seen any other company in, I don't know, 5 or 6 years who offers a true 21-day leasing guarantee. So not about evictions, so I apologize, but
No,
it's
guarantees are guarantees, man.
it's part of the gold plan. It will save you. It will probably save you money in the long run. I mean, we might earn a leasing fee. Average days on market is they're improving, but it especially if you have a high end property that rents for over $3,000 a month, those generally still take over 21 days to rent. It doesn't matter where you're at. So that's my piece on that.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about the collections phase. So, after you've gone through this eviction, you've kicked out the tenant, you've done everything you need to do. Now you need to collect some money that the tenant owes you. It's a difficult thing to do. This is obviously not something that's easy for most people to be able to do. Just tracking down a tenant to try to get money from them can be difficult after they're kicked out of the house. So, most of the people who are evicted, of course, also have lost a job. Like I said, they've gotten a divorce, whatever it may be. So they're already in a bad financial position. Trying to squeeze blood from a turnip doesn't usually turn out too well. So you can garnish wages and bank accounts if the tenant has any to garnish, but in a lot of cases, they're not going to have it. So usually what you're going to have to do rather than doing that is you're usually going to have to go to a collection agency. And, property managers, like we have a relationship with a debt collection agency that only works with property management companies, and they do a really good job. And we get checks this month. We've gotten something like 12 checks from that. So I mean, we're constantly getting money from that collection agency. There are collection agencies that will work with individual landlords. So unlike the insurance products, this is something that you can find if you're on your own and don't have a property manager. But usually it's going to be those collection agencies that don't specialize in rent collection like the ones we work with. So that's something to keep in mind. But that's usually your best bet to collect money is through a collection agency, because what they'll do is they'll put the debt on the tenant's credit report, and then it might take time, but usually at some point down the line, that tenant is going to want to buy a car, buy a house. We've even had people settle up what they owed because they needed to rent furniture. And what is it, Aaron's furniture rental? They called us up and said, hey, we got somebody here. Their credit report says they owe you money. So, the tenant paid us up because of that, because the debt collector put it on their credit report. So sometimes it takes time, but that's usually your best bet of collecting from a tenant after an eviction. So, okay, last thing we want to cover today is those new eviction laws that I had talked about earlier. So this year, very importantly, there were 2 new laws that were passed in the state of Georgia. A lot of this is going around, by the way. I just saw yesterday that I think it was Pennsylvania, if I remember right, they're considering doing a squatter bill also. So Florida did one a month or 2 ago. Lots of states are getting into this because the squatter problem is becoming a major issue nationwide. So squatters are different than normal evictions. A normal eviction, you've got a lease. This was someone who was originally supposed to be in the house. They just stopped paying. A squatter is someone who never had a right to be in the house in the first place. They just break a window and get in, or they force the door, and then they set up like it's their house. This is especially a big problem in Georgia. There was at one point 10% of the properties owned by one of the large institutional homeowners in the state had squatters in them. A full 1/10 of their properties were stuck with squatters. So that's really what precipitated this. The state legislature came in and said, we got to do something about this, because all of these landlords can't be going to court to get an eviction for someone that isn't even supposed to be in the house at all. They're literally just stealing the house at that point. So what the state did is said, now all you have to do basically is submit an affidavit that says this person is a squatter, and then the sheriff will show up or local law enforcement and tell the tenant, you got to go. Excuse me, not the tenant, the squatter. You have to go. There's no going to court. None of that's going to happen. Now, the one out that the squatter has is they can submit their own affidavit that says, no, I'm here legally. The landlord is lying. But then if they go to court and they can't prove that the landlord was lying, then that's a felony. So now they're in big trouble and they're going to jail. So, there's much better protections in place now for squatter situations in Georgia. So keep that in mind. If you run into that situation, it's not a traditional eviction, talk to a landlord tenant attorney and have them use that new squatter law to get that person out much more quickly. The other law, unfortunately, that was passed this year is not so good. So the first one was good news. The second one is not. So the new law that was passed says that the old way of sending notice to tenants is no longer okay. We can't just send a letter to the tenant and say, this is your 3 or 30-day notice to get out of the property. It is now a requirement to go out to the house, take a physical letter in a sealed envelope, and post it on the door. And that's the only way you can give official notice to a tenant that you're going to file eviction. So you can't file eviction unless you've done that. So we fought this as hard as we could in our industry trade organization. There were, the National Rental Home Coalition fought against this. Everybody tried to fight this because it's an actual dangerous situation. So, I mean, in a lot of cases, you can actually get into physical altercations with tenants by going out to a house where they haven't paid the rent. It's kind of gruesome, but I would recommend a lot of you go on the internet and search for Ohio landlord decapitated, and you can find where there was a tenant who was serving an eviction notice on. This was probably 2 or 3 years ago, and the tenant had a samurai sword and actually decapitated this landlord who was serving an eviction notice. So these things can be extremely volatile. It's not something you want to do. So if you get into a situation where you do have to serve an eviction notice on a tenant, now that the state has changed the requirement, you have to go out and physically serve that notice, hire a process server. Do not do this yourself. This can get yourself into not just, get yourself into trouble. This can get you literally physically harmed. So, people who don't pay their rent, some of them are just people who fell on hard times. They lost their job, whatever it may be. But some of them, like I said, are professional tenants, and some of them are violent, and you really have to be careful. So, this goes into effect on July 1st, which is really why we wanted to do this webinar here before the end of the month, so we can get this word out to our clients and potential clients to let you know that this changes in just a few days. So if you do have to have an eviction, remember you got to do a physical notice. So anything you want to add to that before we finish up today, Zach?
Yeah. Squatters. I've had to confront squatters before, and I'm really grateful you've never asked me to do this, but I have been asked by people in the past to confront squatters. We need you to go out there and find out what's going on, knock on the door, call the cops. I was up all night the night before. I'm just worried something's going to happen. Bad neighborhood in Atlanta. I got to go and do what? So I've seen that before. And I would just like to say, just always have a professional screen your tenants, your applicants. It's not worth it. It's really not.
Yeah. If you take any message away from today's webinar, that's probably the one to take. Is screening is the best thing you can do. Making sure you get a professional to screen people will avoid 99% of these problems, so you never have to deal with it anyway. But if you do get into a situation where you need to evict someone, whether it's a squatter or a tenant, use professionals to take care of that. Don't try to do that yourself. So we are out of time. This ran longer than we expected to. We're actually a few minutes over, so didn't really have time for questions, unfortunately. But if you do have any questions, please email us and we'll be happy to get right back to you. If you email us at info@revolutionrm.com, we'll be happy to get back to you real quick with any answers to your eviction related questions. Like I said, if you came in late on this webinar, we will have a video going out by email in the next week or so to everybody of the full webinar. We'll also get that posted on our website, so watch for that. If you didn't miss anything, we'll be sure to get it out. So hope everybody found this useful. We will be back in 3 months with our next webinar. We haven't decided what the topic's going to be yet, but we'll get that information out to everybody. So thank you to Zach, thank you, Abby, and thank you to everybody who showed up to the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you.